The end of the Second World War in 1945 marked the beginning of the remainder of the century. Emerging from it came an ideological conflict in the Cold War. Two formerly allied world powers in the United States and the Soviet Union seeking to spread their own ideologies into the long recovery following the deadliest war in history. The development of the Cold War was heavily hinged on the Korean War. On August 6, 1945, the United States dropped an atomic bomb in the Japanese city of Hiroshima, and 2 days later the Soviet Union, who had thus far not been in conflict with Japan, did declare war on them and began to invade their puppet state in China. On August 9, the US nuked the Japanese city of Nagasaki, and a day later sent 2 officers to Korea to occupy the south. The US worried that the Soviets would invade and occupy all of Korea, so they claimed the land south of the 30th parallel, a latitude line that splits the Korean peninsula roughly in half. A few days after Japan agreed to surrender on August 15th, the Soviets, as predicted, did begin to invade Korea from the Chinese border in the north. With the two forces meeting at the 30th parallel, the US and the Soviets agreed to split the peninsula and temporarily control the south and north respectively. Japan officially surrendered on September 2nd and the fighting all but stopped. The surrender treaty required them to hand the annexed island of Taiwan back to the Chinese. The Soviets then pulled out of China and annexed Japanese islands north of the mainland, which remain part of the Russian Federation today. Korea was taken from Japan by the United States and the Soviet Union, who set about rebuilding the nation. In May 1948, the US military government in Korea held a democratic election which saw Syngman Rhee made president of the new Republic of Korea in the south, taking over in August. In the north, Kim Il-sung was made dictator of the new Democratic People's Republic of Korea by the Soviet Union a month later. With democracy and capitalism established in the south and a communist dictatorship established in the north, the two powers left behind sharply contrasting regimes. They each gave their side ammunition, but unlike the Soviets, the US limited South Korea's out of fear they would use it to try and invade the north, especially since Rhee had threatened to do so. By 1950, both powers had pulled out of Korea, and on June 25th of that year, North Korea used its firepower and ammunition given to it by the Soviets to launch a surprise attack on the south. Within 4 days they'd captured the capital Seoul, and by mid-August they'd taken almost the entire peninsula, but for the southeastern city of Busan and the area around it. The US military budget at the time had been reduced to a tenth of what it was during the Second World War. There was uncertainty over whether they should try and fight back against North Korea, as they had left South Korea with very limited material to defend itself. US President Harry Truman described the North's attack as a direct challenge of free nations that the US had to meet, and he called the newly created United Nations to stop the aggression. General Douglas MacArthur took the US-led UN forces into South Korea to try and take back control. The UN command was made up of 17 countries, with around 90% of its forces being American. This war marked the first time black and white American soldiers were sent together in an integrated unit. Resistance against the North with ground troops was proving only partially effective for the UN, as they had successfully halted the North's troops but didn't make any progress in the front lines themselves for a month until mid-September. MacArthur decided to change the UN approach by using the US Navy to land on the northern city of Incheon on the west coast, around 15 miles from the outskirts of capital Seoul. They successfully took control of Incheon and began to head east in an attempt to cut off the North Koreans that had invaded south. The North retreated and the UN advanced. The UN captured Seoul on September 25th with a three-prong attack from southeast, southwest and northwest. By late September, the UN had forced all opposition out of Seoul, and a few days later made it to the border. The troops awaited orders on whether or not to cross the 30th parallel into North Korea. There was debate on whether crossing it and overthrowing the regime in the north was a good idea, but the American military wanted nothing other than a complete victory. South Korean troops crossed the border by the start of October, while the UN captured the rest of the south, and then followed them a week later. Within around 10 days, they captured the capital Pyongyang, with North Korean resistance little match for them. By October 24th, they reached the Cheongcheon River, and General MacArthur ordered his troops to invade all the way up to the Yalu River at the Chinese border. Within a day, they made it to within 60 or so miles of the Yalu River. When some UN forces made it to the border a week later, Communist China ordered its army across the border and sent the advancing UN forces into retreat. For 2 weeks, the front lines remained stagnant, with the Chinese soldiers guarding the border and the UN forces positioned near the Cheongcheon River in the west and more further north in the east. US Air Forces severely underestimated the number of Chinese soldiers that were lurking at the northern border. Their estimate of around 70,000 turned out to be over 300,000 due to effective camouflage from the Chinese army. On November 21st, the UN made pushes forward mainly in the east, only for the Chinese army to push them far back and eventually retake Pyongyang a week later. UN forces, severely weakened in low morale, eventually retreated past Seoul, which fell to the Chinese on January 5th. General Matthew Ridgway was given command of the 8th US Army following the death of his predecessor Walton Walker the previous month. Following the Chinese rout, Ridgway began what was known as Operation Wolfhound to try and find out where the southernmost Chinese resistance line was. US Air Force intelligence found that the Chinese were actually retreating instead of advancing on the UN. UN forces returned north and within a month had recaptured the city of Incheon, and Seoul was once again in sight. By March 15, Seoul was successfully recaptured, but this time the UN forces kept their heads up and continued to advance, reaching the border by late March. Over the next 2 weeks they took more land in North Korea again, but this was condemned by President Truman. General MacArthur wanted to expand the war into China for their aggression with airstrikes on their mainland, as well as making another attempt at capturing the whole Korean peninsula. Harry Truman was very wary of how risky these tactics were, as he feared it could provoke further intervention from the Soviet Union and become a direct worldwide conflict between the free market capitalist powers and the communist ones. But with a twist. The Soviets advanced their research of nuclear weapons after seeing the US use theirs on Japan and successfully developed their first one in 1949. Thermonuclear war wasn't in Harry Truman's plans, so he limited MacArthur's power. With tension rising between the two, Truman sacked MacArthur on April 11th and had General Matthew Ridgway replace him as UN Commander-in-Chief. Within just over 2 weeks, the UN lost almost all of their gain land north of the 30th parallel. A final UN push at the end of May resulted in a significant recapture of North Korean land by mid-June. With the front lines as stagnant as they had been during the war, lives being lost with little progress made, as well as the ever-growing threat of it turning into a global conflict, Truman decided it was time to end the war peacefully. Representatives of both sides agreed to meet in the village of Panmunjom between the two front lines, a meeting point today known as the Joint Security Area, where the two sides still communicate with each other. The UN wanted to draw a border on the front line, whereas the North wanted it kept to the 30th parallel. Not surprising, given that the amount of land both sides wanted was nearly 3 times as big as the land that was required to give up for it. This was further complicated by the negotiations over the prisoners of war kept by both sides. As the peace talks stalled out, the armies on the front lines built bunkers, trenches and walls to try and maintain their position and build more resistance against any advance from the other side which may have followed. The UN used their superior air forces to weaken North Korea by attacking their power stations and electric plants, which brought the country to almost a standstill, pushing them towards an armistice. The negotiating stalemate continued, however, until Dwight D. Eisenhower was elected US President in January 1953. He went to Korea and hoped to gain the required perspective to come up with a solution. He asked soldiers and servicemen on the front lines to discuss their thoughts on how to handle the war. His desire to end the war was given a huge shot in the arm a few weeks later when the Chinese President Mao Zedong expressed the same desire, possibly out of fear of a nuclear attack, which Eisenhower hinted he might consider. The armistice was eventually signed on July 27, 1953, effectively creating an international border across the front lines. The UN's superior air power eventually forced the armistice, and with it more South Korean land than at the start of the war. No official peace treaty has been signed to this day, meaning the two nations remain locked in a stagnant conflict. The trenches and bunkers built between the front lines settling and the armistice being signed have been further embedded into the border since the armistice, making it almost impossible to defect one way or the other. Countless checkpoints, barbed wire, walls, security guards and landmines that have been built on both sides in an area known as the demilitarized zone have cemented the border almost permanently. The leadership in North Korea has since been passed on to Kim Il-sung's son Kim Jong-il and then his son Kim Jong-un, while South Korea has continued as a democracy with elections and a free market economy. South Korea today is a first world democracy with a free market and free press and is one of the richest nations in the world. The North regime though has enslaved its own people and didn't ever rely on Soviet aid. The Soviet collapse in 1991 led to a famine in the late 90s where nearly 2% of the population starved to death. South Korea, China and the United States have since subsidised North Korea with food aid. Today North Korea is one of the global threats to the world as they have increased their nuclear weapons development, while South Korea remains strong allies of the United States and the West. Nearly 700,000 soldiers alone died in the Korean War, including around 180,000 UN and South Korean soldiers in order to keep South Korea free, and in doing so saving tens of millions from what is seen as the most oppressive regime still going today.